Good morning, everybody. I see we already have some people here today, bright and early on a Wednesday morning. Thanks for joining us. This is the Turfgrass Epistemology YouTube and podcast. I'm Travis Shaddix. I am a former, all sorts of stuff. And I'm glad to have you here today. A few housekeeping items. Don't forget, I broke my tooth. I got to go to the dentist tomorrow morning, so we will not be on tomorrow morning. I'll try to get on tomorrow afternoon if I'm not shot up with drugs and I can speak. If not, then I'll come on Friday morning or as soon as I can thereafter once the drugs wear off. So that's all I've got to do for housekeeping because I want to get into today's episode. Today, I'm super excited because I've gone over a couple papers from the author I have on today, and I felt sort of odd because I was like, I think I'm screwing this up. So I just emailed him and said, hey, can you come on and go over this other paper with me because I don't want to mess this one up. This one's really important as well. So there's three things that really get me excited about scientists, and that is scientists who publish a lot, and scientists who publish a lot on practical information. And my guest today, Dr. Ross Braun, checks all of those boxes. Good morning, Dr. Braun. How are you?
Hey, good morning, Travis. Great to be here.
If you look up Dr. Braun's information on Google Scholar, it'll go, well, that's pretty good. And then you look at the years he's been doing it, which is not that many, and you go, well, holy crap, holy cow, this guy's publishing a lot. That's what I like to see. And if you look at your work, I love scientists who don't lose sight of the practical importance of their work, right?
Yeah, a lot of the research I was doing at Purdue University and even now at Kansas State University, it's a lot of applied research. How can I get this out to the practitioner, to the professional? So it's a lot of my focus on many different areas, I guess. So yeah.
Yeah. Your background real briefly is you actually owned and operated a lawn care company in North Dakota, if I'm not mistaken, for several years before joining the academic world, I suppose. Is that true?
Yeah, that's correct. A little background about myself. Born and raised in North Dakota, had my own lawn and landscaping business through high school, part of college. And then while I was doing my undergrad studies at North Dakota State University, I switched over into the golf course industry actually and started interning at golf courses. After working at a few different golf courses around the country, realized, hey, I wanted to go on to grad school and kind of dive into the science behind all this turfgrass management side of things. And so then after my undergrad at North Dakota State, I came down to Kansas State here and got my master's and continued on here for my PhD. And then after that, I started a postdoctoral position at Purdue University, working for Dr. Aaron Patton at Purdue. And that kind of evolved into a research scientist role that I was there for a little over 4.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then this position opened up here at Kansas State University, where I'm currently at as an assistant professor of turfgrass and landscape management. I'm the director of our research station here, where we conduct turfgrass science research. I oversee all the undergraduate program for our undergrad students majoring in turfgrass management. So I oversee the curriculum and advise all them. And then I have my own research program here at Kansas State University as well with 3 grad students. So
that helps me understand how you got all those papers out. So you're working at Purdue with Aaron for several years as a postdoc.
Yes, for several, yeah.
Yeah, that explains it exactly. He doesn't sit around doing nothing.
No, we were pumping him out. We were busy.
Yeah. That's a good time. One of my most favorite memories or whatever when I was a postdoc just for a year or two. And I think I got 5 or 6 papers out in like a year. It's just fun to be able to sit there and just write if that's what you enjoy. You know, it sounds like that's what you
do. Yeah, and I do enjoy that. So I enjoyed getting out in the field in the summertime and then writing all winter pretty much. So.
Yeah. You have a couple really good graphs in the paper we're going to talk about today. I want to make sure we end up getting to those. But that helps explain. You know, I was curious, like how in the world do you get that many papers out that fast? And Aaron and the guys at Purdue have a great program there, and you hooked onto them and really pumped them out. That's great. So, and now you're at K-State. Is that Dale's position at K-State that you have now?
No, it's a combination of Dr. Steve Keeley and Dr. Kathy Lavis, Kathy Lavis taught more on the irrigation side of things.
Oh, okay.
And then Dr. Keeley and Dr. Fry, they were doing all the teaching for the turfgrass classes, right? And
okay.
So Dr. Keeley's still here, but he's a department head, and so I took over all of his teaching for turf, and then I took over the irrigation side of things for Dr. Lavis. So,
Oh, okay.
and
Okay.
then yeah, Dr. Dale Bramer, he retired last summer, about in 2022, about the time I got here. So, we have yet to fill his position. So.
Oh, okay. He's such a nice guy. I mean, I
Yeah.
like seeing senior guys like that. I don't mean senior in the sense of age. I mean senior in the sense of experience and knowledge. And he's just so, I don't know, humble and pleasant to be around and nice. I was like, man, it's so, it's easy to have an inflated ego when you're as smart as he is, but he's always very easy to approach and very nice and caring of other people.
He was my advisor when I did my PhD here, so I definitely learned a lot from him. So.
Well, great. That's fantastic. Well, thanks for the background. Let's get into today's episode or show and the content. And that is, I went over a couple of your papers, and then I got to this one, and I'm like, I want to make sure we get into this because you have a decision tree in there that I like, and I want to make sure that I get it correct. And so who better to talk to and explain it to us than the author himself who wrote it? So tell us a little bit about this paper, the project, how it came about, what questions were you trying to answer as you began this work and started writing it up?
Yeah, so this project, it was funded by the USDA NIFA organization. This was part of a larger low input multi-university grant, and myself and Dr. Aaron Patton's kind of responsibility with that grant is we first started things out writing a literature review on fine fescues. And so I led that through a multi-university author team. And what we kind of found doing that literature review on fine fescues is there's a lot, these fine fescues, we label them as low input grasses. And there's been some research in the past and to kind of show the performance being managed as a low input site compared to other species. But like the same fertilizer regime or irrigation regime was applied across all those, and there wasn't really any quantification of what was actually going into that system. And so we can see from past research that, yeah, these fine fescues do really well when we manage them as a low input, but then, okay, well, how much actual less inputs do they require if we start comparing them to other cool season grasses? How much less fertilizer, how much less pesticides do they require? And so we wanted to set out and start actually saying, can we put some numbers to this? Can we actually quantify this? And then with all that, we know there's just improvements through breeding programs with genetics of these grasses. And so can we start to separate out some of the newer cultivars, compared to some of the older cultivars? And what we found also with that literature review is, there's some older, and this kind of goes not just for fine fescues, but really, all grasses. There's some older cultivars that have been around for many, many years that are still sold. And in the case of fine fescues, they start giving some of the fine fescue different taxa like a bad reputation, just because of the poor performance, and it's kind of the same way with tall fescues, right? Like Kentucky 31, K31 tall fescue, which has been around for, 60 some years now or more. But it's still commonly sold because it produces a good seed yield. But it's just a really low quality turfgrass. It's that forage type tall fescue, right? And so it's the same situation with fine fescues. We got one, for example, like strong creeping red fescue. There's a cultivar called Boreal.
Okay.
It's still very commonly sold today, and it produces a really high seed yield up in Canada. They grow it a lot up there. So the seed growers can make a lot of money off it and make good income. But when it trickles down to the turf management side of things, it produces really poor quality. And so that's one of the cultivars we included in this study to compare and say, hey, look, could these newer cultivars, we know they have better performance, but do they also require less inputs than some of the older cultivars?
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. We have that problem here in Kentucky where Kentucky 31, people go to the big box stores and they see Kentucky 31 or they see Kentucky bluegrass. And so they end up buying it and putting it out on their lawns. And what Dr. Munshaw and myself have found over the various in-depth studies that we've done here or did here before they closed is that that species of Kentucky or the species of bluegrass and the variety or cultivar of tall fescue are really what you don't want to put in your lawn here in Kentucky, in central Kentucky. And it just, the inputs are substantially more than just the other turf type tall fescues. So it's interesting. You had a similar idea or similar observation in fine fescues as well. So there's
Yeah.
different cultivars of fine fescues that require more inputs than say others, or at least that was the observation. And then the idea that you had was, can we actually quantify that and measure that?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And we'll see when we start talking about this, but we included Kentucky 31 because it's the same problem in Indiana
Okay.
or even here in Kansas, right? We got people that see the K31 or Kentucky 31 tall fescue on the shelf. It's cheaper seed.
Yep.
And a lot of people maybe get that confused thinking it's Kentucky bluegrass.
Yeah.
Or they're just the price of the seed is cheaper. And so they go that route and then they end up paying for it later on because they're having to mow it more often or having to throw more inputs.
And it's the first, it's a big pallet right in front of with the box stores. When you walk in, it's a big pallet. It says, Kentucky 31 on it. And the other seed oftentimes is a blended seed with something else. And it's stuck in the back in a, whatever, 10-pound bag or 5-pound bag in the back. And I walked by there. I'm like, oh man, can we please help us out a little bit here? We're doing all this work and then they end up using these wrong varieties. But anyway, or the higher input varieties, I should say. So what you've talked about is basically the introduction, right? I mean, that's sort of the setting as to why you did it and what you were observing and sort of the setting. Let me just read the objectives, or you can read the objectives, whatever, and then let me read it. And then if you want to add anything to it or if I missed something, let me know. But so the objectives of this study were to quantify the performance and the amount of fertilizer and pesticide inputs of cool season turfgrass species when managed as a variable input turfgrass system, including fine fescues. That's actually much more challenging. We're doing something like this similar in the world of soil testing, where you want to quantify like inputs, and there has to be some sort of metric that you use to trigger an input, right? And it's actually much more complicated than it sounds. Oh, we're just going to measure the amount of inputs. Well, you do, but there's more to it than just that. So in I say northern, okay. And to determine if newer cultivars can provide higher turf quality with fewer inputs compared to old cultivars. And that's what I'm a soil fertility person, so the inputs and fertilizers are what kind of gets me interested. But when it comes to the new cultivars versus old cultivars, I haven't seen a whole lot of that on the newer cultivars. I haven't seen a lot of work on that, and this work obviously includes that. And that's something that really interests me because when I'm trying to explain to my neighbors, for example, your lawn was planted when your house was built in 95, 96. At some point, the genetics, the improvements in genetics are going to be good enough to where you need to consider replacing your lawn, because it's not, tall fescue is tall fescue. It's not that way. It really is substantially better now than it was 25, 30 years ago in terms of the varieties and the cultivars and the management inputs that are required to maintain an acceptable lawn. Is that a fair statement, you think?
Oh yeah, I completely agree. And it could, for a variety of reasons of those genetic improvements, whether it's better disease resistance or better drought tolerance, potentially less water requirements. Mm-hmm. And so there's multiple ways you could go about that. If someone wanted to incorporate those new cultivars, you can obviously do a complete renovation and just start over, and that's maybe your best bet. But you could also just by maybe continually to overseed in the fall and start incorporating in those newer cultivars and maybe make a more dynamic stand that way. That could potentially work as well. Yeah. That'd be some interesting research as far as obviously be able to separate out the new from the old that easily. But how does that population shift?
Yeah, I think here in my neighborhood, the neighbors have just done the overseeding for a while, for several years. They just put a little seed out in the fall. I don't know what seed they got out of the store. I don't know. I wasn't here, but they've done that for a while. And then what happened was I came in and I just wiped out my lawn and put in a new variety. I mean, a blended 100% turf type tall fescue blend. And they were like, "What's going on over there?" And I said, oftentimes when you're dealing with a hodgepodge mixture of Heinz 57 turfgrass and weeds and all sorts of cultivars, it's easiest to me just to set it clean, start with a new slate, and then put in the seed that you want. And then they caught on to that, and I want to do that. And then the next neighbor. So now there's 3 of us in this little cul-de-sac that have done that over the last 3. And I was like, well, you can keep adding and adding and adding. And my take on it is, if that's satisfactory to you, then who am I to say it's not? If you want to overseed in the fall and you're okay with that, then great, no problem. I'm not going to tell you not to do it. But if you want a lawn like what I have, or you want something more uniform, then it's probably best to just cut your losses, start from scratch, and then you have a nice, clean, uniform stand of a blended newer variety turf type tall fescue. Anyway,
Yeah, I
that's
agree.
I wonder what it would cost. I mean, I see more and more money papers coming out. Like, what does it actually cost to do these things? That's not historically been a standard that we use. I wish it was, but like, how much does it actually cost to put forth the upfront money to wipe out the lawn, start from scratch, and then measure the inputs from the beginning to the end versus just simply applying in the fall, overseeding in the fall, and never, it'd be interesting to see how much that costs if there's some way we could quantify that, but I guess that's for another time. Okay, so the materials and methods. You want to walk through the materials and methods? I'll just kind of scroll down as you're kind of walking through it.
Sure, yeah. I'll get a little brief overview here. So, this experiment, we conducted it up at the University of Minnesota. We collaborated with Dr. Eric Watkins up there, and then obviously down at Purdue University in Indiana. And then so both sites, we conducted this as a multi-year study. So we had 3-year study at both sites. And then we set up as a randomized complete block design. We had 15 treatments. Those 15 treatments were individual cultivars of different cool season grasses. And so we had 8 cool season grasses, and some of those cool season grasses, and you can kind of see them in table 2 there on the next page.
Yeah.
Some of them had either a new and then an old cultivar, so we could start comparing these new and improved varieties compared to an older variety, but we didn't do that with every individual species.
Okay.
Where some species like sheep fescue and Kentucky bluegrass and perennial ryegrass, we just had either one cultivar, or for the Kentucky bluegrass, we made sure to include multiple different types of Kentucky bluegrass. And so we see with more research coming out, these Kentucky bluegrass cultivars, depending on their type, respond differently to different management settings, whether it's a compact America or a midnight and so on. So we wanted to include some different classifications of Kentucky bluegrass.
So you're dealing with a pretty big study. You got 15 treatments and 2 locations.
6.5 foot by 6.5 foot plots. So it took up quite a bit of space. So
yeah, those are big areas to do. And you have 2 locations over 3 years. So this is not something we just threw out in our backyard. This is a pretty substantial study here.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we seeded everything in the fall just based on, best management practices. And our main goal there was just to get everything fully established before the next year, so we could start the next year actually taking data.
Okay.
And so we didn't take any data during establishment. We just wanted everything established. And so we have, our pretty typical seeding rates there for these different species.
Yeah.
And then we irrigated everything during establishment to promote establishment. And then the following years during the growing seasons, we actually turned off the irrigation during the summertime to manage these as what we're calling a variable or low input system that would be a non-irrigated turf site.
Oh, okay. So can I interject just 1 second? So basically, if I understand this correctly, you have 15 different turfgrass treatments. You seeded them, allowed them to establish, watered them, allowed them to establish, got them quote unquote fully established, I guess you want to call it that. Got them established beyond at least outside the establishment period. And then after that, you turn the water off. And then at that point, you started to collect data?
Yes, that's correct. And we actually came in that following spring at both sites. We did give all the treatments a little bit of fertilizer there, a half pound of nitrogen in Indiana and 2 half-pound applications in Minnesota, just to promote and get everything up to 100% establishment before the summer set in. So, but then after that, we turned off the irrigation. Obviously, they're getting rainfall, and in Minnesota, that was almost pretty much enough rainfall. And in Indiana too, although there was times they were definitely experiencing drought stress, then they would bounce back in the fall. And then so during those growing seasons, the following 3 years, from spring green up all the way until they're, about November, and they're pretty much shutting down for the year, we were going in at different time points, and that's where we get into the data collected there. And really, maybe the best way to summarize this is just looking at table 3. And so this is where we have that decision tree that we came up with, and at different rating frequencies and different things we're rating for there, we would go in and rate all the plots and based on these different ratings and thresholds, and then that would determine if a response application was required for each individual plot. And so we rate everything from visual turf quality to visual turf cover, then also different weed. We split up the weed classifications by the type of weed, whether it's a winter annual grass or a perennial broadleaf, and then we would rate those at different times of the year. And we set thresholds. So, for example, if like summer annual grasses like crabgrass and goosegrass or foxtail, if we had over 10% infestation in the plot, then that would trigger a response application to then spray that individual plot. And then we would catalog every single time that happened, and we started to add up our pesticide inputs, but then also fertilizer inputs, which we scroll down in that table a little bit more there. For the fertilizer response, you can see there we had a variety of different things that could trigger a fertilizer response, whether it was a low turf quality score, which we rated on a 1 to 9 scale. And, typically for a lot of turfgrass studies, we would say 6 would be minimally acceptable, right?
Yeah.
And if maybe I was working with a golf course putting green, which has a higher expectation, I would probably say 7 being minimally acceptable. But for this being kind of what we're thinking, a low input site, non-irrigated, we said, okay, maybe there's a little more wiggle room there, and we're going to say 5 is minimally acceptable. So anytime it drops below 5 due to poor quality or density of that plot, then we would apply some fertilizer, an application of 1 pound of nitrogen using a slow release.
Okay.
At a proper time of the year. If it was like that in the middle of summer in July, we wouldn't apply a fertilizer response, just because that wouldn't be a best management practice to throw down a bunch of fertilizer in the heat of the summer, right?
Yeah.
And then also if we saw different low nitrogen diseases like rust or dull or spot or red thread, that would also trigger a nitrogen fertilizer application as well.
Okay. So just let me reiterate repeat what you said, and so I understand it. Basically, the response was set, meaning you applied a pound in, or you applied a pesticide at a labeled rate, or herbicide, or whatever. That the rate and what you would do was set, but the trigger that caused that or resulted in that was also set at a certain threshold, meaning that, okay, at this level, we're going to consider it to be unacceptable to us, I suppose, or the homeowner, however you want to quantify that. And at that point, we're going to apply a herbicide, or we're going to apply a fertilizer. And just so I'm clear, that was on a per plot basis. And so that's how you ended up with your variation?
Yeah. So we would go in, and at these different times, we would obviously rate all the plots.
Yeah.
But then an individual plot would either get the application or not, depending on where it was at. So yeah.
Man, that is a lot of work, man.
It was.
that is a lot of work. Wow, that's
so there
impressive.
Were times where, like, we have 75 plots here, and these 35 plots need herbicide application. So we go out and flag those, and then spray those.
Oh my goodness!
And report it. Yeah.
Wow. So if you had however many plots, 45, what was it, 45 plots, or how many plots you ended up having? 75 plots. And you had 3 plots that were less than quality of 5, then you would just go and apply 1 pound nitrogen to just those 3 plots, and do it only at the time of year when it's appropriate to do so.
Right.
Yep. Wow. Man, that is really impressive. You have much more patience than I do. That is a lot of work. Just to give you an idea, it's to give people an idea. You have to understand you're standing out in a field with little 2 meter square plots, or little 6 by 6 plots or whatever. And you're looking at, I assume you had little borders, or they weren't grown together. I don't know how you managed it in that location, but there's just so many plots, and they have to be rated, they have to be managed, they have to be looked at. They're like little babies. You're constantly keeping an eye on them. And then when you see something, you have to make a note. I have to treat just that plot with just this herbicide, for example, or just 1 pound of N. So to keep up with that that's really impressive. So well done on that. Wow.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's well done. We're doing something kind of similar to that, and we have a decision tree as well. And the reason I'm glad you went over this table, and I had it highlighted to go over, is because I'm kind of leaning heavily in that direction when it comes to things like applying nutrients for just normal BMPs. In other words, to just go out and apply a pound of N in the fall because it's that time of year is probably an antiquated notion, an antiquated management practice. You probably do need a pound of N if you want to maintain some level of quality. But not just because it's the fall, right? I mean, if the turf grass is acceptable and it's been growing well, I think we should maybe consider doing something like this, or adjusting the management practices in a way that incorporate a decision tree type mentality rather than just a standard 1 pound or standard 2 pounds or whatever the case is, just because it's the fall,
Yeah. On a similar note, I try to, as far as talking about weed control, so often, and I'm guilty of this myself, you think, it's the springtime, I want to put down a pre-emergent for crabgrass.
Yeah.
But we got to stop sometimes and just think, okay, what is my crabgrass weed pressure at my site? Have I had a pretty good, have I been putting down a pre-emergent herbicide for the last couple of years and reducing that crabgrass population seed bank in my soil? And so maybe if I don't put down a pre-emerge this year, I look at it more as save on not putting down the pre-emerge and do some sort of post-emergence application if I get pressure, and I could just spot spray that out or hand weed it out if there's a really low population, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we need to stop and think more often like that instead of just continually doing the same, whether it's like you're saying, fertilizing nitrogen in the fall every year, whether we need it or not, or putting down a pre-emerge every spring, whether we need it or not. So.
Yeah. And the newer cultivars are going to change a lot of that. Like, because my lawn has the newer cultivars of turf type 12 I don't have the label in front of me. Is that in general, it tends to be a greener lawn than some of the lawns in my neighborhood that are 20, 25 years old. And I don't know what my neighbors are doing, but I know what I'm doing, and I'm not applying any nitrogen because I don't want to mow it. So, and it looks fine, so it's like, well, why would I apply nitrogen if it looks fine to me? So, and I think a lot of these newer cultivars are going to, their value is going to stand out more whenever, you're in if your mentality is, well, you know what, I'm just going to wait until there's a slight little unacceptable turf, and then I'm going to, maybe add a little in or something. I know that's sort of a reactive approach rather than a proactive approach, but I think we can do that more frequently with these newer cultivars. Anyway, that's for another talk, I guess, too. So
no, I agree. Yeah.
So table 4 is the temperatures and stuff. Unless you have something important to talk about in this, I'm going to go pass through it, unless there's something critical.
No, that's just highlighting just the kind of climatic differences between the sites. So.
Okay. Okay, so let's see, this table, I'm going to see if I can flip this sideways. I don't know if I can do this or not. Let me see. This is going to stretch my limits of my ability here. But this table here is the visual turf quality cultivars 2019, 20, and 21 by season in Indiana. And I just highlighted the far right one. The far right column is the overall average of turf quality. I know that's super small on your screen, but do you want to just hit the highlights on this? Sort of, we're looking at the differences in turfgrass quality among cultivars.
Yeah. So what we did here is we took monthly turf quality ratings in each individual plot, obviously, and then we averaged those out based on the season of the year, spring, summer, and autumn. And then we did that. We averaged them over each year, first year, second year, and third year. But then we also averaged what's the overall average across 3 years for each site. And then it starts to stand out, not only numerically, but also statistically. Some of these fine fescues, such as the Cardinal 2, Strong Creeping Red at the top, the Sea Mist Slender Creeping Red, the Radar Chewings fescue, just overall consistently higher turf quality than say some of those Kentucky bluegrasses near the bottom, and especially perennial ryegrass as well. So
there's also this what is this hard fescue, Gerard? It was quite low. Is that a older cultivar?
That's an older cultivar.
Okay.
That's an older cultivar of hard fescue.
So
it's actually one of the worst looking ones.
Oh yeah, it's one of the worst ones. It's even lower than perennial ryegrass.
That one was released in 1949, so it's still grown and you can still find it. So
right here, I mean, if you're going to, this is just from Indiana, we're going to look at the next site in the next table, but this right here, there's a lot of numbers on this table, but if you look at the overall average, the take-home message is that the newer cultivars over 2 or 3 years appear to have a higher quality. Now, the other many of the other cultivars, with the exception of the Kentucky bluegrasses are still at the acceptable limit, I guess. If you're going to say 6 is the limit, I think you said 5.
Yeah, and we said in this case we said 5 was
You said 5, okay.
acceptable in this study. So yeah, there's situations where for example, the Ambrose chewings fescue, which was a slightly older chewings fescue, but not as old as say the Durar or Boreal, but
Yeah,
it still provided pretty good turf quality, and
yeah,
that's attributed to these fine fescues
yeah.
being liking the less inputs and managed as a lower input site. So.
Okay. But from 6.4 to 7.4, you're going to see that the average homeowner would be able to probably see a difference in a full point for sure. So there is an advantage in terms of turf quality. Let's go down to the Minnesota location now. So now we're in Minnesota on the same turf quality. What do we find here?
So and this is just typical in any sort of research. We have different sites, so we have different a different person rating the study. So, in turf quality scores, we have to keep in mind it's a subjective score, right? So something that I might give a quality rating of 6, you might give it a 5 or a 7 or something, right? And so the numbers are a little bit different, but the main trend is still there with the fine fescues doing better than, say, the Kentucky bluegrasses, and then some of the cultivars of the fine fescues performing a little better than the older cultivars. But there wasn't as much of a difference than that we saw at Indiana with some of those new versus old cultivars.
Yeah, it looks like everything in general has sort of declined. Do you think that's probably as a result of the rate or not necessarily the environment that it was in?
It was a little combination of both, I believe. They got hit with rust up there quite a bit more.
Okay.
So they're doing more nitrogen fertilizer responses across the board. Almost the entire study was getting hit by rust quite a bit.
Okay.
And so that at times decreased a lot of the plot quality.
Okay. But in general, the Kentucky bluegrasses are at least a full point, if not more, lower in both locations than the fine fescues. Yeah. The tall fescues are sort of maintaining their level here relative to the fine fescues. They're, well, for 31's not doing well at all.
31, yeah.
Yeah. But this one here is okay. The Regenerate, I think is what it's called. So the tall fescues are doing okay. The fine fescues are probably towards the top, and then the Kentucky bluegrasses and Printer Rise are consistently towards the bottom. It looks like in both locations for the most part.
Yeah, and another thing I want to highlight here is with these fine fescues. So we have for fine fescues, it's this grouping of 5 different species or subspecies. I always tell people, there's not technically a turfgrass that's called fine fescue. It's just this grouping terminology that we give these 5 different species and subspecies. And what we've seen through research is there's really, depending on where you're at in the country, some of the fine fescues do better than others. And so up in Minnesota, they consistently see the hard fescue and the sheep fescue do really well up there. And it may be just because it's a little bit cooler climate. And what we usually saw in Indiana was the strong creeping red, and the chewings fescue did better than hard fescue.
Yeah.
And then so over here in Kansas, what we typically see is the hard fescue and the sheep fescue and the chewings fescue do quite a bit better than, say, a strong creeping red or a slender, just because we're a little drier on the drier side. And so really kind of depends on where you're at in the country of which one of these which one of these fine fescues is going to do a little bit better than others based on climatic differences. So,
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it was one of my questions I actually sent you prior to meeting, is that where's the geographic boundary? Because here in Kentucky, we have some fine fescues as well, but generally speaking, we'll recommend fine fescues in shaded environments where we just can't seem to get the turfgrass to grow too well. Fine fescues tend to do better, but in general, we don't really see, I mean, if they're both in sunny locations, we don't really see the fine fescues perform quite as well as the tall fescues. And I don't know if that's the heat we have here or the water we have here, but it certainly seems like fine fescues will grow fine here. It just seems like the tall fescues might be a little more suitable for our location. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, if it's a heat thing or what. But
it's a heat thing. It's mainly we have the same situation in Kansas, and so in this kind of middle transition zone type area, I'm in Manhattan, Kansas, which is similar to southern Indiana, northern Kentucky as far as the climate. I would typically recommend fine fescues more for shaded areas, not so much for full sun. Now, if we get in the northern parts of the country, middle to northern Indiana and up, those Wisconsin, Michigan, all those, you can fine fescues will do great in the shade there as well. Don't get me wrong, but you could also start to venture out into more full sun areas as well, just because of the little bit cooler conditions. So,
Okay.
but yeah, definitely when we get more in the transition zone, we got to maybe think more shaded areas. But that's not to say they could potentially work in the full sun as a low input site. But if we're trying to manage these fine fescues in the full sun, and be giving them the same fertilizer and irrigation that we would give a tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass lawn, they're going to actually decline in quality probably.
Okay. That's all great stuff. Let's get to, I want to have enough time to get over these two figures that you did, which I love. Whoops, did one too many. I got to flip this page. These two figures are awesome. So I want to make sure we get to those. So that was the quality. Okay. I highlighted some stuff here, but I want to get to some of the discussion and the results. And I highlighted essentially the entire section of inputs. I don't know if we're gonna have time to get to it, because I was highlighting this. I'm like, I'm just gonna highlight the whole section because this is really important. But what I'd like for you to discuss, if you can, real quick, is if I can get it on the screen here, this figure right here, which is figure 1, and then the next figure is great too. So I want to make sure we have time to discuss both of these. So what we're looking at, if for those listening, are two figures. Turf quality is on the y-axis, and then the season is on the x-axis. So we're talking about spring, summer, autumn, and we're talking about turf quality from 1 to 9 on the y-axis. And we're looking at the Indiana site on one graph and the Minnesota site on the other graph. Can you just walk us through? We have not all of them. We have several of the turf grasses as they change in quality over the season at each location. Can you walk us through just real quick the highlights?
Yeah, so we had Indiana on the top for A, and then Minnesota on the bottom, and we do actually have all the treatments here. What we've done is we've combined them based on their fine fescue complex or aggregate, and so we combined the strong, slender, and the chewing fescue all together as far as those newer cultivars, and then we combine the older cultivars together. So when you see something like Festuca rubra complex, that's the strong, the slender, and chewing's new ones. Okay,
thank you for explaining that.
That's the sheep and the hard, and so since they're within that complex together. But yeah, essentially what's going on here with what we started looking at, okay, well, if there are any trends over time on how these turf grasses, as far as quality, what's that trend over time? And what we saw on the top one there for Indiana, which is keep in mind, it's a warmer climate. We get a little bit more heat and drought stress in the summertime, obviously, compared to St. Paul, Minnesota. And we established these grasses, and still starting out the next year, they all started off pretty high quality, except for our sheep and our hard fescues. They're a little bit slower to get established. And so they have a little bit poor quality from the get-go. But then we see that's kind of the green and the yellow lines there. We see that upward trend over time. So they just progressively got better over time, even though they were getting very little inputs. But then the other fine fescues, they were also starting a little bit on the lower side there in Indiana, but they also have that upward trend.
Yeah.
But then we look at, what's the grasses that have the downward trend over time? And that would be our Kentucky bluegrass and definitely the perennial ryegrass. And then our tall fescue kind of has a little bit more slight downward trend, but not nearly as much as the Kentucky bluegrasses and the perennial ryegrasses. Yeah. And then if we looked at the Minnesota site, it's not as much upward or downward trend, more flat trends over time. And just again, the more mild climate over time there, but we still see a little bit more of an upward projection with the sheep and the hard fescue newer cultivars. Yeah. So the main take home here is those fine fescues might be a little bit harder to get going and established, but once they do, and you start managing as a low input system, you should progressively see improvements over time in quality, or at least holding steady as far as quality. Whereas a perennial ryegrass or Kentucky bluegrass you're going to get, you get them established, they look great right away. But just then managing them as a low input grass, they're just going to be continuing to decline, and it's an uphill battle. Yeah, and I think that's pretty commonly accepted, particularly with perennial ryegrass, where we get really rapid establishment, sometimes in less than a week, and it looks great. And you see it germinate, and you see the grass turn green or the lawn turn green, and then over time you start to see a decline. Sometimes within the same season, depending on where you're at. Obviously, in the South, where they overseed with that, or they used to overseed more with that, it would die in the summer because it gets so hot, but it would look good early on. So you see that up at the
up at the Indiana site where you see a perennial ryegrass look really good early on, and then it just progressively gets worse and worse and worse to where it's unacceptable at the end of the study for whatever reason. So the take-home message really is it might take a little time to get these cultivars to get established, with the ones that tend to be better in the long run are a little slow to get started compared to the other ones that are really good to get started. But if we're sprinting, maybe go with the perennial ryegrass. But if you're looking to go the long run and kind of see 5-10 years out what's going to be best for you, it seems like some of these other varieties of the fine fescues are the way to go in this study. Just don't be taken back by the slow establishment and the slow at the beginning being slow.
Yeah, and I should add, the fine fescues for the most part, especially the strong, creeping red, slender, and chewings, they're pretty quick to germinate, just like tall fescue. They're right around the same germination speed.
Okay.
Obviously, perennial ryegrass is probably the fastest, right? And so they are faster to germinate and establish than Kentucky bluegrass. So it's not so much about establishment speed; it's just starting off. They don't look as good as a perennial ryegrass, which is probably just looking more lush and more green, right?
Okay, fair enough. Okay. The input section is just remiss, but I'm going to do that with these tables. This is the same sort of table we had before, where it was turf quality, but now we're looking at inputs. And the questions I have a couple questions on this table. We're looking at the average nitrogen fertilizer, the number of fertilizer, and pesticide applications. So we're looking at the amount and then the number of applications. That's pretty straightforward. But when you say annual fertilizer and pesticide input applications, you're simply saying we went out and we applied fertilizer, and that counts as a 1 on this plot.
Yes.
And on the other plot, let's say it's the same grass, but it's a different different plot, but it's the same grass. And that one we actually had to do 2 applications, so that's a 2. And so that's what you mean when you say annual fertilizer application. It's a very unusual metric to see in the literature, but if I'm reading that right, that's fantastic and not easy to keep track of.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So like you're saying, one application would be a 1. If it didn't receive anything, it'd be a 0. So yeah,
man, that's impressive. So we have so let's just briefly talk about the annual nitrogen requirements. So if you applied 49, or you applied 1 pound of N on this plot and 0 on the other, then the average would be half. If you applied 1 and 0 and 2, and you take the average and so forth. But even if it's the same treatment, that's how you're coming up with these averages. And it looks like they varied from as low as maybe a third of a pound here of nitrogen with the slender creeping red fescue. Maybe that's the lowest. And then the highest, at least numerically, the highest was looks like 1.75 pounds, almost 2 pounds with the perennial rye. Am I reading that right?
That's correct. Yep.
So that's actually not crazy high, 1.5 pounds. That's annual on perennial rye. Of course, you're managing these as low input. So you're only trying to meet a minimum level of your standard was 5 on the quality scale. So the idea was to keep it above 5, right?
Right. Yeah. And that, I would agree, that is probably low on the Kentucky bluegrass perennial ryegrass side. But what we'll see here next when we get into the next figure is when we're trying to manage these Kentucky bluegrasses or perennial ryegrasses as this variable input where we're doing this responsive treatments, it's like we just consistently need to be throwing fertilizer at it, and it's just probably never getting up to what we want it to be.
Okay.
To where we were managing these, say, a perennial ryegrass or Kentucky bluegrass as more of a medium to high quality lawn, putting down 4 or 5 pounds of nitrogen. We're going to have high quality lawn, but we're putting down 4 or 5 pounds of nitrogen. Yeah. And so in this case, it's on the low side, but we also have lower turf quality. Yeah.
So these sort of data are really speaking to people like me as a homeowner. Like, I want an okay lawn. I don't want a lot of weeds. I just want to be able to. I don't really want to mow it that much. I don't want to water it that much. I don't want to spread any further. I don't want to do anything to my lawn other than enjoy it. Honestly, that's the way I function. But the neighbor next door might have a different priority, a different threshold. They may want their lawn to look like a golf course or something. I don't know. But this is really speaking to, I think, a huge chunk of homeowners and lawn care operators who, they're not trying to maintain Augusta national standards. They want to maintain a minimum standard that's acceptable. And what this is showing is that there's a difference between the species that you have on the lawn. That's going to determine how much you actually need to put in. And the newer cultivars seem to consistently require fewer inputs. Is that accurate?
Yeah, no, I agree. Yep. And
Okay.
and so many of those fine fescues, but also the turf type tall fescue, which was a newer cultivar
Okay.
uh,
Right here.
of tall fescue. That also,
Yep.
it's what 60 there, so 60 kilograms. So that's
Yeah.
a little over a pound.
Pound and a
What, 1
quarter or something. Pound, little.
pound and a quarter.
Yeah, something like that.
But it's on the lower side if we look at that compared to say the bluegrasses or the ryegrasses, and so
Yeah.
that it did fairly well. So
That's true. Yeah, the bluegrasses and ryegrasses are requiring quite a bit more. Now, when it comes to the number of inputs, so the number of times you got to walk across the grass and spray something, we're seeing the same trend where we have, the slender creeping red fescue is almost basically a half of an application on average. I mean, versus up to as high as many as 3 from the perennial ryegrasses and the high 2s with the Kentucky bluegrasses. So the Kentucky bluegrasses and the perennial ryegrasses are requiring more applications. They're requiring more amount of product than some of the fine fescues. Is that seems like what I'm seeing here? Okay. But to me, well, let's get to the next. Okay, let's get to the next thing. I'm anxious to get to the graph because I want this graph is awesome. Or this figure is awesome. But let's go move to the Minnesota site. So same table, Minnesota, average nitrogen, average total inputs. Do we see anything different here than we did in the previous location?
there's similar trends. The one thing I would highlight is, so even more northern climates in the United States, again, it's even more favorable for, say, these fine fescues. And if you look at, slender creeping red, sea mist there, the radar chewings, the jetty hard fescue, and the sheep fescue, it shows 49 kilograms there in the first year. So they gave it a pound of nitrogen the first year. But if we go back and look in the text, we mentioned that, hey, that first spring in 2019, when we were pretty much all these were very close to 100%, but we thought, okay, we need to give these a little shot of nitrogen before we get this study really going, mainly because it was actually the bluegrasses were slower to grow in. But we were like, we got to just treat all the plots the same. We want them all to start off on the same foot. And so Minnesota they did 2 applications of a half pound each in April and early May to equal that 1 pound of nitrogen. And so if you look at those numbers in that first, as far as the fertilizer applications, and you see some of those fine fescues getting 1 pound of nitrogen in that first 2019 year.
Yeah.
After that, they didn't get any fertilizer
for
the next 2 years. And they did really well. If we go back and look at those turf quality scores, they didn't receive any more fertilizer other than that first application that all the plots got. And so that really drastically reduced the amount of total inputs and all that.
Great. Yeah, I see that. Yeah. So 1 pound the first year, the next 2 years you didn't apply anything, and and you still had the quality above 5. So great. So that, and then when you look at the total number of applications, again we see a similar trend where the perennial ryegrass here is requiring more than in the other location, but it's everything's requiring a little bit more than the other location, but it's higher than all the other treatments. We're requiring basically four applications of either combined fertilizers and pesticides. And then I don't see anything even close to that. That's the only A in this whole thing. So then we see the bluegrasses requiring 3 essentially applications, and then the fine fescues again requiring essentially 2 or less than 2 applications. So it's a consistent result. The magnitude changed based upon the location, maybe the rater, whoever, there's a number of factors there, but the differences among treatments seem to be fairly consistent among different locations.
And the one thing here is the perennial ryegrass, obviously, same for both sites. It requires a lot of inputs to maintain acceptable quality. And then we see that with the bluegrass as well, but we do see some variability with the bluegrasses. So I just want to mention that is, we included 4 different classifications or types of bluegrasses here with these 4 different cultivars. And we did get some reviewer responses saying, hey, we probably should have included like a Ken Blue, a Kentucky bluegrass, or some of these, maybe an older Kentucky bluegrass that is known for potentially to be used at a more low input type site. And so that's the one thing I will mention is there could be some Kentucky bluegrass cultivars that maybe would have performed a little better or required a few less inputs, but I think generally as an overall, I just think you're going to have more likelihood of success with these fine fescues or a tall fescue compared to the bluegrasses. So
perfect. Let me flip this page around one more time. Oops, I'm doing some dances here with the with the screen here. Okay, this is what I want to talk about. So I rarely see stuff like this. Okay, well, I should say rarely. It's just not really that common. And these last two figures, we're actually below the conclusion. We're in the conclusions now, but before we get there, there's a little bit of results left, and that is, in my opinion, these graphs. Why am I interested in these graphs? Because I think anybody, I don't care if you're a scientist or a homeowner, or you're my 11-year-old autistic son, can look at these figures, and they can pull something out of these figures in a practical way that they can then, oh, okay, I get it now. This makes sense. That's why I'm interested in these graphs. And what these are turf quality on the y-axis, and then inputs on the x-axis. So fertilizer and pesticides. So the number of inputs is what we're measuring on the x-axis in the turf quality. And he's broken these up into quadrants. So would you mind, Ross, kind of walking through what it means to be low input, low quality, low input, high quality, and so forth, and where the various species and cultivars fall?
So just setting these up, we got turf quality on the y-axis on both there from 1 to 9, and we got our average number of inputs per year on the x-axis from 0 to 5. And we have Indiana on the left and then Minnesota there on the right. And we then have our 15 different treatments here indicated by the different symbols and their color. And then we split this quadrant up into 4 quadrants based on either low input, high quality, which would be always in the upper left, meaning they require less inputs and they will provide higher quality when we're managing them as these kind of variable input, low input type systems. Then the upper right would be a high input, high quality, which meaning they're going to require more inputs, but they will also still provide high quality like the upper left. Then the lower left is low input, low quality, meaning they require very low inputs, but you're going to get low quality out of them. And then the lower right is high inputs, low quality. And that meaning in that quadrant there on the bottom right, meaning, hey, we threw a lot of inputs at these, but they were still providing very low quality based on the practices of this experiment. And what we typically found is the Kentucky bluegrasses and the perennial ryegrass would end up in this bottom right quadrant, meaning we threw a lot of inputs at them and they consistently just, again, quality never got up to what it was compared to the upper left or the upper right there. So
yeah, so you don't want to be in the bottom right, basically, where you're putting in the bottom
right. Yeah, and we didn't see anything in that lower left, the low input, low quality quadrant, but we typically see those fine fescues in the low input, high quality, or kind of right around the middle. Mm-hmm. And then the tall fescue started to kind of drift more towards the high input, high quality. But again, that turf type tall fescue did fairly well overall, and was kind of right there in the middle, mm-hmm. leaning to the upper left.
So let's talk about some of the cultivars. There's one or two cultivars, or maybe 3, that are in the top left-hand quadrant in both locations. So one of them is the sea mist. And the other one that seems to sort of be in that general area is, well, there's a couple of them. The Marco Polo is sort of in the top left consistently, and the Jetty. Is there any other ones? So so there's the fine fescues really.
The Cardinal 2 strong creeping red was typically in there, and also the turf type tall fescue, I should mention, is close there, and the radar chewing fescue. So for the fine fescues, it's always those new and improved cultivars, right? And some of the older ones like Boreal and Ambrose chewings, those were almost kind of in that upper left corner or close to it, mm-hmm. But definitely not in that bottom right like we'd find with the Kentucky bluegrass and perennial ryegrass. So we find those newer cultivars, the fine fescues, and then the turf type tall fescue most consistently in that upper left.
Pretty much the upper left, the low input, high quality, or the turf type tall fescue is sort of in the middle, but in that area of the top left hand quadrant, and the fine fescues, and then consistently in both locations we have the Kentucky or the bluegrasses and the ryegrasses. So, I mean, so oftentimes I think homeowners and lawn care operators can get rightfully confused or lost in a lot of this scientific jargon, but this to me seems to speak. It's 3 years and 2 different locations, And we see fairly consistent results when it comes to, how much input do I need and where's my turf going to fall on the quality scale? And if you want, to me, it seems like if you want to have a low input, high quality lawn or, whatever turf you're managing, there's some information on this graph that I think people can walk away with and not be confused at all by it. I like that a lot. I really appreciate you doing that figure. That's really good. I like this graph a lot. Okay, let's get to the conclusions and we'll wrap this whole thing up. There's a couple things I just want to, I like it when people make firm conclusions. It's very rare. But if your results support it, make the conclusion. I tell grad students, if your results support, if you're going to make a firm conclusion, you better have firm results to back it up. And I like practical, take home messages that someone can walk away with who's not a scientist. And that's what I've highlighted. I think I did this in yellow. So let me just read the last paragraph or last two that I've highlighted, and we'll go from there. You can add to it if you want to. The results prove that fine fescue taxa, especially newer cultivars, are excellent choices to provide high turf quality with fewer inputs, reducing fertilizer and pesticide inputs by an average of 41 to 56% or more compared to tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, and perennial ryegrass. So right there, I mean, if you want something to walk away with, that's a great sentence. Okay. In addition, older cultivars of the ruber species can also help turf practitioners reduce fertilizer and pesticide input significantly compared to traditional turfgrass species like Kentucky bluegrass or perennial rye. Okay. And then we get to the last paragraph here. I want to get to this, at least to the yellow part here. Fine fescue taxa, especially newer cultivars, are the best choice for low-input, cool-season turfgrass systems in the Midwestern United States. Now, you framed it within this location. This is what you found, and that's appropriate. Tall fescue is another potential option for low-input, cool-season turfgrass systems. However, it may require more fertilizer pesticide inputs than fine fescue. So, and that's what you found consistently, is that the fine fescues in your locations consistently were at the top, and then tall fescues, and then below those were the Kentucky bluegrasses and perennial rye. And now here comes the yellow that I've highlighted. Turfgrass practitioners who wish to establish and manage low-input, cool-season turfgrass systems should refrain from using most Kentucky bluegrass or perennial ryegrass cultivars, which are not long-term sustainable options because of the high fertilizer and pesticide input requirements to maintain consistent, acceptable turf. Now, I'll say this. You have much more courage than I do, okay? Because it's not easy for me to write something like that in a scientific paper. But if it's true and that's what you found, then say it. At the end of the day, this information needs to be employed. It needs to be used. And if you're a turf practitioner and you're looking for low input, high quality, then you need to shy away from these types of turf grasses and move more towards those types of turf grasses. That's basically what you're saying, correct?
Right. Yep. And I can't remember if it was probably a combination of both Aaron and myself, or maybe that was him pushing that sentence more. I don't know.
Oh, okay. I don't know either. Well, I just every time I write something real firm, I'm like, I just write something real firm, and then I'm like, oh man, I guess there's an exception to that rule. I better be careful, and so I end up sometimes chickening out and I don't write it in there. But the last sentence, and then we'll wrap it up. These findings further highlight the importance of proper species and cultivar selection based upon site conditions, expectations, plant management strategies, and available inputs. For example, if improper species or cultivars were planted, then increasing fertilizer and pesticide inputs is not a long-term solution to maintain adequate performance. Instead, turfgrass renovation and planting the appropriate species and cultivars will increase the likelihood of a more sustainable turfgrass system with less inputs. And that's what I'm trying to get at when it comes to cost. At some point, Ross, I'd like to see some scientists run the numbers on the cost. Because at some point, what you're saying is that you've been riding this car for 25, 30 years. And you're having to change the ignition. You're trying to change the things are breaking on you. You're having to change the spark plugs. You're having to constantly keep up with this old car because it's falling apart. Meanwhile, at some point, the expense of buying a new car is less than the expense of maintaining the old one, right? And that's kind of what you're saying in this last paragraph when it comes to turf grasses.
Yeah, and just from a environmental or sustainable standpoint, it just cut your losses and start over with the appropriate species for your site, which will cut down on inputs. instead of just continuing to throw more fertilizer, more pesticides at it to get it up to the quality that you expect, you know.
Yeah.
So with that, with the costs and all that, we know we didn't factor any of that into this study. It would have been great to start doing that. And I agree. I think that kind of work needs to be done. And I'm not currently doing anything like that, but to similar to that, I am currently conducting some research that's looking at taking the same kind of decision tree with these thresholds. I've changed some of this, settings a little bit on this decision tree, but I'm looking at, okay, what if we sod an area compared to seeding an area?
Okay.
Obviously, sod costs more money up front
Mm-hmm.
compared to seeding, which is cheaper. But if we start taking into account, maybe I'm going to need a herbicide application or two because of when I'm growing in the grass, I'm getting a lot of weed pressure, and that's going to affect the overall stand of the grass.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that when I'm growing in the seed, I'm going to need more fertilizer as well. Whereas if we were to sod that area, we don't have to fertilize as much. And so starting to quantify these inputs, but also put some cost to it to help out the turf practitioner of, yeah, the sod might cost more up front, but maybe you save more in the long run with less inputs.
You might.
And
yeah.
Numbers to that. So,
I just think when it comes to like things like pesticides, we're used to hearing, it costs $55 per acre or cost whatever, $60. In ag, they talk about that a lot. We're going to gain so much dollars per acre of yield or whatever. And in turf grass, it doesn't seem like we've really utilize that concept to its fullest extent, where we can actually talk dollars and cents to people and show a homeowner, show a lawn care operator, hey, it's going to cost you $2 up front per square foot, but versus say seed, which whatever the number is, I'm just making these numbers up, say $1 a square foot. But over 2 or 3 years, you can see where the sod is going to cost this much. I don't even know what the results would be. I'm just saying that general concept of including the cost of maintaining it in the management practices and so forth. I wish I did more of that, and I don't. I like it when we see research that includes dollars and cents. You just see it a lot in ag. We don't see it a lot in hort.
Yeah, and it's probably just because the ag you can quantify it by the yield, right? And we just can't. It's difficult to do that in the turf industry. So
perfect. Well, thanks so much. I mean, basically, the take-home message is, species matter. New cultivars are not just out there because, that's the new marketing thing. There's a lot of money that goes into developing these cultivars. There's a lot of criteria used to pardon the pun, weed out the lower end, cultivars. And the ones that make it to the top, hopefully, are the ones that make it to market. And it really does show an impact when it comes to the inputs that you need to maintain them. It really is. You can see it, And I don't know if it's true or not. I'll end it with this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm not a seed guy, I'm not a grass guy in terms of like the level of knowledge that you all have. I'm a soil person, but it seems to me like if when the question comes up, well, how do I go find these? How does someone go find these new cultivars? It seems to me that if you don't know, then the cultivars that people are selling at the big box stores, assuming that it's a turf type tall fescue or a fine fescue, have not, as long as it's one of the newer ones, then the chances are pretty good that it's better than what you got in your lawn if your lawn's 20 or 30 years old. So I don't know if it's necessarily, I have to go find this specific one, this specific cultivar, and if I can't find it, then I can't do it. Well, that's great if you can find it, but if you can't, seems to me the chances are good that the cultivar you put in, if it's a newer one, is going to be better than what you got. Am I naive in saying that?
I agree with that. I think it also maybe depends a little bit on what species we're talking about. So we see typically with tall fescue, the turf type tall fescue, if you look at some of the NTEP trials around the country, there's a lot of good new cultivars coming out, and they're not that much different, And so when we talk about like turf type tall fescue, really any of the new ones are great. Maybe the bluegrasses, there's a little bit more separation as far as the genetics there, so you maybe need to be a little more careful depending on what your site conditions are.
Okay.
And so it kind of, I'd say it's a little bit maybe dependent on what species you're going after, but it is difficult. That's the hardest part. For our field day here in Kansas, I highlighted we have a fine fescue NTEP trial and a tall fescue NTEP trial that I spoke on. And the hardest part is, as a turf practitioner or homeowner, how do I then, when I see these new cultivars that are doing really well, how do I purchase these? Where do I get these at? And you can go in these big box stores or your garden centers, and they might be selling them, and it's maybe in some sort of blend. What I try to say is, to kind of compare it to, if you were going to go buy a new car or a new TV or computer, whatever, maybe you're going to do a little homework first, right? You're going to go and research it a little bit, figure out what exactly do you want, what is going to fit your need. And so we need to approach buying our grass species cultivars that same way. We can't just go into the store and just think it's going to be the best thing for me. So it's going to take a little bit of homework. It's going to take a little bit of looking online, looking at the NTEP data, which is sometimes hard to navigate through, and they're working on getting that website more user friendly to then put in your location and actually have some more clear info, I should say. But it's going to take some, diving into some literature and looking at some results to figure out what's potentially the best. And then you can go somewhat educated into these stores with an idea in mind of what to be looking for.
Yeah.
And that's the way I would approach it, instead of just going in and I wouldn't just go to a car dealership and buy the first car I see. So I'm going to do my homework. So
I like that. I like that analogy. Yeah. I mean, I do a little homework when I'm looking for a car or looking for something like, whatever I might be doing. I don't just walk in and buy something off the shelf. And I do like that idea. So people can go to places like NTEP, the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program, to find the most current cultivars. And like I said, if they can't find, again, I might be wrong. I'm not a seed person, but I just say, if you can't find that specific variety, the chances are good that, the varieties that are in these newer blends are probably better than what you got. So, especially if your lawn's 30 years old, which is the case in a lot of locations. So,
it's also just being mindful of what's included in that blend or mixture. Obviously look for anything that, if it says like VNS, variety not stated, I would shy away from that. But also maybe just being educated on what are some of the older cultivars as well, and being on the lookout for making sure like Boreal or K31 or so we're not purchasing these older ones, even though they're mixed in with some of the newer ones.
Yeah, I mean, this is as a homeowner, not as a scientist per se, but as a homeowner, I'm not really interested in buying blends that like, let's say in Kentucky, we generally recommend turf type tall fescue for home lawns. And when you go to the box stores, it's never 100% turf type tall fescue. It has some bluegrass in there. It always has perennial ryegrass in there to get the seed to kind of germinate early and makes it look nice. But I don't like that, because I know I'm not looking for perennial ryegrass. I'm not looking for bluegrass. I don't want those in my lawn, even if they will die out later on. I want 100% of what I'm looking for, turf type tall fescue. So what I end up doing is I end up going online and finding a seed blender. And the one I end up using is in Tennessee. And I just order a bag from them. That costs me $150 rather than $40 at the big box store, but I'm getting a 50-pound bag versus whatever it is, 5 or 10-pound bags at the big box store. But I know in that blend, it is what I want. It's a newer variety. I can see it, and I know what I'm getting. So that's a little bit of extra step, but I think it's worth it, because otherwise I'm going to be getting a blend that only has a small percentage. When I say small, say 50% of the seed in the blend is actually the turf that I want. Like, for example, turf type tall fescue, as opposed to having a mixture of other things in there that I don't really want. So anyway, just keep that in mind. Yep. Dr. Braun, thank you so much. There was a good response. I think there's a lot of people find this very useful. You corrected me. I would have definitely said a few things incorrect, so I'm glad you were here to explain that. And the decision tree is brilliant. Those figures are brilliant. I like a lot of the work you've done in this work. I'm looking forward to see more of your work come out, and I'm 100% confident that you will keep pumping them out, because you got some good grad students doing some good work, and I'm looking forward to their future work. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the time and you having me on here. So
perfect. Everybody else, remember, tomorrow I won't be on in the morning. I'll probably be on in the afternoon. But if I'm not, because I can't talk because I got Novocaine or whatever's in my mouth, I'll try to do it on Friday morning. And next week we're off because of fall break. Thank you for everybody for showing up today. Have a great day. See you next time.